Hi everyone, welcome to today's discussion with Professor Samuel Moyn at Trinity College Dublin. My name is Donna Lyons and this is seminar 24 in our speaker series. Samuel Moyn is Henry R. Luce Professor of Jurisprudence at Yale Law School and a Professor of History at Yale. He's written several books in his fields of European intellectual history and human rights history, including The Last Utopia, which many of you will know, and edited and co-edited a number of other books. His most recent books are Christian Human Rights from 2015, based on the Mellon Distinguished Lectures at the University of Pennsylvania, and Not Enough Human Rights in an Unequal World, which will also be familiar to most of you. His newest book, which we're discussing today, is Humane: How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. Over the years, he's also written in venues such as the Boston Review, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Dissent, The Nation, the New Republic, and the New York Times, as well as the Wall Street Journal. So it's a great privilege to speak with you today, Professor Moyn. There's been a huge amount of interest in this talk, so thank you so much for making the time for us today. So we're going to discuss your book, which was published just this month. If you would like to hold it up, if you have a hard copy there, that would be.
Oh, I forgot.
Don't worry,
have it here.
Fine. I'm sure this is going to be in many households in the near future. So that's perfect, and we're all very much looking forward to obtaining the hard copies. So in this book, you say that in the years since 9/11, we've entered an age of endless war. So with little debate or discussion, the United States carried out military operations around the globe. And it hardly matters who's president or whether liberals or conservatives operate the levels of power. The United States exercises dominion everywhere. And we'll talk more about that shortly. You also then say that as American wars have become more humane, they've also become endless. And this book argues that this development might not represent progress at all. So I found the book extremely interesting, and congratulations on the fantastic reception that it's received so far. So just to start off, just wanted to ask a question about this terminology around humane and humanity. So in the book, you say that the humanization of America's wars has become a part of the syndrome of their perpetuation, not a step beyond them. So for those in attendance who aren't familiar with the laws of war, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the trajectory of how and when and why the laws of war have become more humane, and the effect you feel this has had on US foreign policy over the past few decades.
Well, to begin with, thanks so much, Donna, for inviting me and organizing this, and thanks to everyone for coming. I'm really eager to engage with your questions. So this is a book that I think does something different than many historical accounts since September 11th on the topic, because as you know, there are actually two regimes in international law when it comes to war. And one has to do with whether it can start and continue. International lawyers use Latin, although this whole distinction they use between jus ad bellum and jus in bello is pretty new. And that first regime then is whether you can go to war, and it's governed by the United Nations Charter and some other rules. But then there's that other regime on the other side of the Latin distinction, jus in bello, what you can do once you're in war. So it's the law governing conduct of hostilities. And often when people refer to the laws of war, that's what they mean. The regime, sometimes called the laws of armed conflict, and recently for about 4 or 5 decades called international humanitarian law. So those kinds of rules have existed all the way back. War has been legalized. The conduct of hostilities has been legalized as pretty much everywhere that I think we know about. There are rules, for example, in Deuteronomy and in classical sources and in medieval sources. And as you'd expect, like the restraints that get imposed, at least on paper, in these different moments tend to reflect cultural norms. And it's true that we could detect kind of early concerns about human suffering in some of those early traditions. But from what I can tell, the idea that there should be a regime of law that reduces suffering in war is really a modern idea, and I treat it as such. And my basic story is controversial in the literature. It says that it's true that there were some Swiss gentlemen who had the idea of making war humane in the middle of the 19th century, and they got their foot in the door in the first Geneva Convention of the 1860s, which allowed essentially, private individuals and groups to provide aid to soldiers who had died or were bleeding out, wounded on battlefields. But when we look then at the rest of the laws of war for a very long time, and especially as they're implemented in my country's law, we find they're brutal, and their content is about allowing militaries to do what they think must be done. There's a second track such that irregular forces, and especially racialized enemies in colonial circumstances, don't even get the protection of the brutal rules. And then what rules there are, even when they're applicable, are not taken seriously when push comes to shove. And, even not in colonial war, for example, in World War I or World War II. And so I really look after World War II, and indeed pretty long after World War II. Americans began after 9/11 to debate the Geneva Conventions, but they're also pretty brutal. And in particular, when it comes to this 20th century novelty, which continues in the 21st, air war, it's basically unregulated. As late as the 1970s, there's still no clearly enunciated principle of distinction, i.e., a rule that says you may only shoot at a combatant. And even more important, there's no limit on collateral damage. And the history of air wars, when essentially there were no laws, lawyers were never consulted, shows that something big had to happen to generate our ethical priorities. And I say that happened in the middle of the Cold War period, for a few reasons. First, decolonization, really first and foremost, because now there are all kinds of states representing peoples who have basically been brutalized in imperial war for centuries without limits, and they now have a say. Europeans have stopped governing empire. They're allowing my country to protect them. And so it's much easier if you're not fighting war to get moral about it. And then lastly, my country, although it's still fighting wars across the entire second half of the 20th century and into the 21st, has lost Vietnam, and in the eyes of its public and the world public, has sunk to a kind of depraved position. And a lot of things happen in response. There had been in Vietnam, in the Vietnam era, an anti-war movement, but it wanes, and we'll talk about that. But in the 1970s and after, some new developments happen, let's say on the ruins of the anti-war movement. First, there's a mobilization of new reformers who want to bring humanity to law. There had been the Swiss all the way back into the 19th century who are still operating in discrete communications with governments. But now human rights groups decide to name and shame violations of the laws of war, the new laws of war that are updated in the 1970s to make them more humane with the principles of distinction and proportionality. More remarkably, militaries self-humanize, including the US military. And this is a remarkable event, I think. And that's because the military recognizes the public relations hit it's taken in Cold War, circumstances, and thinks it can promise to respect these pretty permissive rules. And so it does make those promises. And then finally, there's this other novelty, which I think the American public cares about how its wars are fought. It gives up some very old anti-war impulse in its history from the 19th century, and even the kind of big anti-war spasm that it experiences around Vietnam. And let's say in exchange, it begins to think that its wars are legitimate if fought humanely. And my argument in the book is that this prehistory is critical for understanding what happens after September 11th.
Thanks, Sam. It's fascinating. And just to pick up on the point you made about the distinction between jus ad bellum and jus in bello, I suppose I'm curious to discuss a little bit the theme you raise in the book around anti-war sentiment on the one hand and the push towards humanitarian warfare once wars have begun on the other hand. So maybe coming back to Vietnam as an example, how do you feel that this move from anti-war to the conduct of hostilities happened, and maybe how do you see that developing into the future?
Sure. So it's an excellent question. I think I just want to make clear first that I'm for both forms of constraint. It's not like we have to choose one or the other, but I am honor bound to report that we've kind of lost one regime, at least for great powers like America and Russia, and we haven't focused so much on it, while we've focused a lot on kind of cleaning up how wars are fought. And so that's the ethical complaint, but it's based on a historical finding of a kind of switchover. So I'd start again the story in Vietnam, because I've tried to account for how the laws of war rose, but we want to know how concerns about aggression or violations of the jus ad bellum regime fell. And towards the end of Vietnam, that when there's already a pre-existing anti-war movement, the My Lai massacre is revealed. And that's of immense importance. And it shows that concerns about atrocity, if they arise in the circumstance where there's already anti-war pressure, they can add fuel to the fire of anti-war movements and make a big difference in stopping wars. The question is what happens when atrocity concern works on its own. So consider the Abu Ghraib revelations, which the reception of which function to remove the bug of torture and other crimes of war from the program of endless war, which goes on today. And so I wanted to figure out, like, how did this happen? Already in Vietnam, there are people like a lawyer I talk a great deal about named Telford Taylor, a Columbia University professor who had been a Nuremberg prosecutor. And they write that, well, you can't really stop great powers unless you beat them. Hitler was beaten. America was beaten in Southeast Asia, but it was still, a hegemonic force to be reckoned with. And more than that, the Democratic Party briefly adopted a peace stance, but it lost badly in consequence. And so from that learning experience, the concern with atrocity was, let's say, winnowed from the larger concern about war itself. And then, as the generational politics of the anti-war movement change, you get a new generation that's concerned about finishing the Cold War, about finding good uses for great power, including justifying illegal wars. So in my youth, the concern about atrocity prevention beyond American borders was at all-time highs and led to justification of illegal acts in the international system, like the Kosovo bombing, on the grounds that it was more important to prevent atrocity or stop it in its tracks. And so I think that sets up 9/11 in a very important way. In Europe, there were greater anti-war movements, and the Chilcot Report ended up causing lots of trouble for Tony Blair, and there's a kind of memory of an aggressive act that the United Kingdom joined George W. Bush in taking. But in America, there was never such a debate. There was just a torture debate, and later under Barack Obama, a debate about civilian casualties as a result of drone warfare. And I basically am trying to suggest that when you have just that debate about how war is fought, you end up in a way purifying a war you forgot to challenge. And I think we're seeing the grim toll of that over the years, and now at 20 years and counting into the war on terror. The basic stance that America took up, it can fight anywhere. Its counterterrorism can take the form of previously unholy targeted killings with drones or standoff missiles or special forces. And the natural response is not to try to constrain their use per se on a kind of global battlefield, but to try to make it more humane. And the book concludes in a kind of character study of Barack Obama, who was a genius, maybe a diabolical one, because he understood the legitimating power of humanity. And when he received the Nobel Peace Prize, and when he defended the drone program at the National Defense University 4 years later, in both instances, he said, the alternative to my endless war is a brutal version of it. And humanity makes it morally appropriate, although sad. And this is the bargain that humanitarians helped arrange, but that above all, Obama's audience accepted. And that takes us to the present.
Thank you so much. So you mentioned Bush and Obama briefly there. And so maybe just discussing a retrospective on the various presidents in the States over the last 25 years, 30 years. On the theme of America's endless wars abroad, could you maybe contextualize this or elaborate on your contextualization in relation to the presidencies of Bush and then Obama and then Trump? And we all know that Biden recently pledged on the 1st of September to end an era of military operations, to what he said, to remake other countries. What do you think is the likelihood of that happening? Or is there a chance that he would nonetheless also become another endless war president?
So it's anyone's guess, but I'll tell you mine. I would begin by observing that there have been two wars on terror. The first began immediately after 9/11 with big intervention and lots of troops in two places, Afghanistan and Iraq. The truth is that because those wars became unpopular relatively quickly, every president since has been pivoting away from that first war, even Bush, but the later three ran against the initial form of the war on terror, and especially the Iraq war. Admittedly, it was surprising to Hillary Clinton that Barack Obama saw that he could exploit this, but he understood the reservoir of misgivings that, at least in electoral circumstances, Americans had towards this early, let's call it, more primitive form of the war on terror. Then Donald Trump, in a really quite shocking development at the time, was able to win against fellow Republicans by exploiting that party's continuing support for the Iraq war, even as late as 2016. And it's amazing, in February of that year, when he was on the debate stage in South Carolina and he attacked the Iraq war, and it was widely predicted that he could never win the Republican nomination, but he did, and he won once again against Hillary for many reasons, most of them horrendous. But it is also true that Clinton could not shake her reputation as someone who had supported the Iraq war and lots of others. And then Biden, by the time he ran, Trump had himself embraced the originally progressive hashtag End Endless Wars, and Biden followed suit. Now, it's true that only Biden was able to withdraw troops entirely from Afghanistan. But the truth is that after Obama's surge in 2009, the troop numbers there have been declining rapidly since. 100,000 for a year or two in the early part of Obama's presidency to a mere 8,000 by 2016 and 5,000 by 2021. And so Biden was finishing something that had largely been completed, although of course it caused this world historical event, the fall of a government. That's all the first war, though. What we need to look at is the second war that emerged across that same period in response to and in replacement of the first. And it didn't involve occupation. It didn't involve lots of troops. It involved control and killing. And it relied on light footprint methods like the drastic expansion of special forces, small teams of men who visit and kill. And it also involved armed drones and standoff missiles in really unprecedented numbers. Bush had experimented with them. Obama took them many, many more places and used them many, many more times, and Trump followed suit. What I'm looking at in that development is the way that the transition from the first to the second war was abetted by its humanization. The first form of war was delegitimized, at least for a lot of people, by claims of inhumanity. Rightly so. The trouble is, it allowed Obama especially to legitimize the second form of war through claims that it was humane. And amazingly, even though Trump promised to be brutal and torture, he couldn't escape this new paradigm. it's still shocking to me that Obama promised to go beyond the requirements of the formal laws of war, which say that you can only strike it with a drone or any other weapon if the military advantage you expect outweighs the collateral damage you anticipate, including civilian death. Obama said we will strike only when we anticipate no civilian death or injury. And Trump kept that rule. Now, it doesn't mean either followed it, but it says something about the legitimation of the promise of humanity that it was made and kept. And so I think it's worth looking at, and that's what I try to do in the book. Biden promised in ending, as you cited, the first form of war to continue the second form. In both of his major speeches defending the Afghan withdrawal, he said counter-terror will continue even as counter-insurgency dies. And he referenced over-the-horizon operations, which means drones and standoff missiles and special forces. So the war paradigm of the war on terror remains intact. And I think, very scary, because great powers set precedents for one another and for an unknown future. And to me, it's extremely disturbing what this second humane form of war looks like for that future.
Thank you, Sam. And there are already a few questions in the Q&A box. So if anybody else has any questions, feel free to put them in there, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. I just have one final question before we bring in a couple of other people. And I suppose, to the extent that you feel there are any links, I'm curious about how you feel that this piece of scholarship ties into your previous work, like Not Enough, Human Rights in an Unequal World from 2018, and The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, 2010. I know they're very different books, but do you feel that there's a scholarly connection between those?
For sure. I hope I'm not writing the same book over and over. And I did write this one as an attempt to not write about human rights. It's still about an international law regime, and I've now retired entirely from international law. So I think it's if you're one, I'll tell you my own sense of the relation of these books. They're very similar in one sense. They're interrogations of, let's say, liberal moralities that I have found questionable, and they locate breakthrough moments in the middle of the Cold War, whether for human rights or for international humanitarian law. I think they're different in other ways. The Last Utopia actually wasn't about law at all. I mean, basically, it was more about political culture and mobilizational strategy. There was a little bit about international law in the United States, just to confirm that lawyers were kind of living in the more general political culture of their times and started becoming human rights lawyers in the 1970s. This book is entirely about law in ways that, may kind of narrow the analysis. You could imagine a broader inquiry into like moral cultures of how war is begun relative to how it's fought. And I narrow the focus to how Americans have accepted and interpreted the relevant legal regimes. There's maybe a way in which this book is even harder on the laws of war and some people who focus on them than I was on human rights, because I claimed in my earlier books that human rights involved the foreclosure of some possibility, but it's not like they were to blame for it. They were a symptom of it. in this case, I'm interested in the way in which emphasis on a certain kind of humanization could actually abet and entrench war, and so contribute even causally to a regrettable outcome. Now, it's very hard to say that actually happens or that there's a better alternative, but I'm raising a suspicion about the laws of war that is maybe more aggressive than my worries about human rights law. At the same time, there's a kind of similar structure between the worry in Not Enough and about economic and social rights and egalitarian hope on the one hand, and this book on the laws of war, because in both books there's a claim that if we're too minimalist, we may become caught up in or companions of or complicit with projects that we might otherwise reject. But I think this is kind of too scholastic even for me to try to figure out exactly how these books all relate, because hopefully they're freestanding, and I've forgotten the first two, and as I'm trying to retire from the topic of the third too.
Well, I think a lot of people on here will still remember those excellent two books, and indeed your other scholarship, and perhaps we'll see some scholarly links being made in the exam scripts. I'll keep you posted. I have Ursula Quill here, who is a PhD student at Trinity College School of Law, and Ursula has a question for you. So I'm going to promote you to panelist so we can see you, Ursula, and work away whenever you're ready. Hi.
Thanks very much, Donna, and thank you, Professor Moyn. Really enjoyed your discussion so far, and I haven't had the opportunity yet to read the book, but I'm really looking forward to reading it. In relation to Donna's previous question, I was greatly influenced by your book on books on human rights, and in particular around kind of collective duties, and just really expanded my horizons on the area of human rights. And in relation to, I suppose, this area, and it's so timely, I think, to have this discussion at present with what we're seeing in Afghanistan, and the complexity of the debate around what Biden's saying as to kind of, well, we can't necessarily be the policeman of the world, but a lot of the discomfort around that you can see especially in liberal circles, which I think is really interesting. And one of the things which I think it was in the human rights and the uses of history, and you touched on how David Reef had kind of stepped back from, I suppose, his kind of contemporaries of Samantha Power and others, and saying was really critical of how human rights was being used as a cloak for military humanism, I think was the phrase. And I suppose I was really interested because I recently read Samantha Power's memoirs, and I'm not sure if, along with looking at Obama's legacy, you've looked at her as well. And I find her a very kind of complicated and an interesting figure, and somebody we follow quite closely here in Ireland for obvious reasons. But one of the interesting things, I think, is that I think it's quite qualified, but towards the very end of her memoirs, I think she is saying that essentially this way of intervention rested on military intervention is unsustainable. But there seems to be just this constant tie to that American values of human rights and democracy, that if we don't lead on them, that we have this ultimate responsibility to lead. And there's an assumption that it's worth America intervening in some way. And I suppose I just love to get your thoughts on, I suppose, how, like, what do you see as the way forward for that kind of that strand of American liberalism, in terms of wanting on the one hand to and obviously there's a huge amount resting on the assumption that actually those American values are worth intervening on. Or do you think that there is, I suppose, that total underinvestment in other areas of foreign policy in terms of the diplomatic corps and that? So it'd be really interesting to hear your thoughts on, I suppose, on that element, and maybe in particular on Samantha Power, but maybe more generally that really what seems to be a crisis of American foreign policy. Thank you very much.
What a wonderful question. Thanks so much. So actually, I did include Samantha Power in the new book, not because of her career in general, which I agree with you is quite fascinating, but because she sought out Obama right as he was, as she recounts in her memoir, about to head to Oslo, and he invited her, as she memorably puts it, as a stowaway to come with him. And during the trip, she writes him a memo about what he should say. And she wasn't the main, draftsman of his Nobel speech, but it's very revealing that she got him to provide a shout out, a reference to the founder of the laws of war, this Swiss gentleman from the 1860s, Henri Dunant, in his speech, who had been the first winner of the Nobel Prize, a co-winner in 1901. And so she knew enough about the history I'm trying to tell that she was able to get Obama to not just, stress how much America cares about the humane laws of war, but to remember where that project had come from. I have no idea, I agree with you that this is a pivotal moment when Biden, who generally opposed the Obama era interventionism after, voting for the Iraq war and seeing it become catastrophic, he's clearly, powerful enough where Trump wasn't to stand by his beliefs about at least this, I called it primitive form of intervention. He has not renounced America's military power. And, the most cynical or, maybe promising, depending on your views, read of what's going on right now is just a vast reorientation from one theater to another, namely to a new Chinese Cold War. And once again, for all the hatred Trump earned, I can't fathom why not just Republicans, but Democrats are following Trump into that confrontation. But Biden is doing so. Maybe he thinks it's what it takes now to get elected, as Trump showed, or part of what it takes. I think if there's an atrocity of the kind that we saw in Bosnia, Rwanda, or Kosovo, or by some accounts in Iraq, Saddam Hussein's rape rooms and torture chambers, it's not as if liberal cosmopolitanism that's focused on using great power, military power for the sake of rescue can just disappear. Mm-hmm. It's so tempting. Yeah. And in those moments, it's appealing ethically to me, and I assume to anyone. It's just that the record is so bleak that it always makes the world worse, and then is hijacked by others who use it for their own pretextual reasons. And again, the Iraq War and possibly other instances come to mind. Vladimir Putin claimed to be conducting a humanitarian intervention in going into the Crimea. Then he went on to annex it. So it will not go away. I do think that for a while we will find it very difficult for anyone to successfully invade and occupy a country. I don't think, even though my main narrative was one about the transition from one form of war to another, that original form can ever be permanently shelved. It just depends on, maybe humanitarian needs, but more likely security needs. And we can imagine a return of great power confrontation with China or others where there will be even world wars. In the meantime, though, I think this new counter-terrorist form of war, which is old in the sense that there were always shadow wars, which the British and the French and the Americans fought back centuries. But this new form I'm stressing isn't just technologically different, it's morally different, because imperial publics never cared that racialized imperial subjects were treated humanely, just the reverse. But now the expectations are different. And so we've moralized this shadow war in a way that to me is going to help it endure.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Sam, for that excellent response. Thank you so much, Ursula, for your question. And we also have another PhD student here, Alan Eustace. Alan, I'll promote you to panelist if you'd like to ask the question directly. You can leave your camera off if you don't, and I'll just ask the question for you. Let me just do that now. And then we have a few more questions in the Q&A, which I'll ask after that. Hi, Alan. I'll go ahead and ask the question. Unless
no, I'm sorry, my camera isn't.
Oh, not a problem.
But I'll ask the question and hopefully it'll be okay.
That's great.
So early in the discussion, Professor Moyn, you mentioned that one of the influences on the sort of changing perception and desire to humanize conflict came from Europeans who didn't have to fight the wars, but instead relied on American military power to do the bulk of the fighting. We know at the moment there's some European politicians would be pushing for a kind of military decoupling of particularly EU states and America, and sort of military and strategic independence on the part of the EU. And I'm curious to think of what you think about that process. Do you think that could be a good idea, or do you think it's likely that a sort of an EU army would have more or less the same endless war approach that the American military has?
Thanks so much. So, I exaggerated a bit, or, even slandered Europeans. I mean, it's not true that they ever shut down their armies entirely, except for briefly in the West German case. And as we know, the United Kingdom has been junior partner in a lot of American adventures lately, and France too, but it has its own, security domain in North Africa where it, like the UK, under the European Convention, in the way that the United States isn't, has had to, fight its own form of humane war. So these are parallel developments, but of course you're right that we've heard rumblings of European security independence for really decades, not all ever taken all that seriously. And I don't know that they seem to be all that much a priority now. I mean, from what I can tell, for even now, Europeans seem to be willing to rest content with America spending, more than the next 8 countries combined on defense year in, year out. And, for that matter, selling a lot of hardware to European countries and other allies. So there'd have to be either a big event or a long period where you'd get a significant change. I think there will continue to be talk of European security independence and probably independent capacity. A lot depends on how the confrontation with China goes. If it's another Cold War, I assume that it will fall to America to lead it militarily in whatever military forms it may end up taking. I don't want to rule out that there could be a kind of new multipolarity where Europeans have armies and drones, and they're not kind of under America's security blanket. It doesn't seem likely anytime soon. As far as I'm underinformed. I'm not sure it would be a good thing. I mean, I'd like to see a multilateral peace architecture, so we don't have to, have this militarization. And I just wish we would go back to, for all the horror Europe wrought in world history, it also was the origin point of multilateral peace ideas and calls for arbitration and, the invention of the League and United Nations. And those have generally, not restrained great power, but it would be a pity if we just regarded that as impossible.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Professor Moyn. I think that's a really good point at which to ask a question which came in from an anonymous attendee in relation to this idea that there has been something of the creation of a peace architecture since the League of Nations, albeit patchy in its effectiveness. But the difference between, I suppose, before World Wars I and II and now, the question is, I apologize if this is outside the topic, which it's not, but is the humane quality that the US tried to give to war verified empirically, albeit with longer wars, or is it a legitimation strategy, which is just for show? So have we seen a reduction in deaths and casualties through this humanity or humanization of war?
I think it's a great question. Just on your kind of prefatory remark, I'm in dialogue in the book with the literature on the rise of peace as an international imperative, at least, what was widely discussed as white peace across the Atlantic, which led, to arbitration, to the League, and, even the United Nations. And I'm in dialogue there with some colleagues, Ona Hathaway and Scott Shapiro, who have presented a kind of celebratory account of this. And it's not that I don't agree with them that there's less war. I just think that the way in which that occurred meant America transitioned from having a minor Pacific empire to having lots of global wars to fight without any, end date. And the security architecture, is not one that prohibits their wars, or for that matter, other great power wars. And so when I was referring to a peace architecture earlier, I principally have in mind one that would keep, Cold Wars from happening, since Cold Wars are fought between great powers. And, America and China both have a veto on the Security Council, et cetera. So it's a meaningless proposition for them to submit to the UN, because it's not, they can veto anything that comes out of it. On the main question, I think it's both. I say in the book repeatedly, it's about ethics and optics. You can do things because they're good and because they make you look good. And I do think that American wars are more humane relative to American wars before. We're talking a lot about the data put out by the Costs of War Project at Brown University. And I think it's clear that the number of dead is, outrageous, but smaller than the number in Vietnam or Korea or World War II. Now, maybe you argue those aren't, the right, comparison points, but I think it really did affect the fighting that the military took the laws of war on board and had, among other, procedures, military lawyers approving target selection. And it really does matter that, even in hot battle spaces like Afghanistan and Iraq lately, the United States is allegedly following the rule of proportionality. I really think it matters outside those areas, under the rules I mentioned, that civilian casualties from targeted killings are supposed to be zero. I think they have been minimized. They're still outrageous, and any war is going to have bad apples and honest mistakes, and just structural evil. That's why our ancestors cared much more about eliminating war, because it allows so much that's legal that is still bad. But if we're I think going to be honest, I think we have to concede that this is not just for show. It's not just rhetorical. It's mainly for kind of cosmetic purposes, but it doesn't mean it's not having effects that can be noted. And of course, that's how the legitimacy works. That enough Americans understand that this is better than the proffered alternative, which Obama insisted was the only alternative of more brutal war. And I think that really matters.
Thank you so much for that answer, and thank you for the question. There are a couple of questions on religion, Christianity and Islam, and I'll just take those two together, and feel free to answer one or both, whatever suits Sam. So from Sue, Sue says, what stands out for me is the way that Islamophobia was marketed after 9/11. This made it very difficult to challenge the war on terror. It was a case of, if you're not with us, you're against us. How can we combat or question the jus ad bellum principle? And then Catherine asks, and says, picking up on the final question Donna posed, this was a few minutes ago, do you see the development of international humanitarian law and its engagement by states being shaped by similar narratives as other areas of international law in the post-World War II period, in particular Christian influences? Any thoughts on either of those?
I think they're both excellent questions. I mean, there can be no doubting the way in which race and religion have affected the history of international law and politics. And, I try to stress the role of both race and religion in the jus in bello regime by just reminding us how easy it was to push people outside of coverage by even the, whatever the rules were, not very humane yet, by if they were not white or not Christian. Similarly, I don't think we can account for the way that states interpret the jus ad bellum regime without taking race and religion seriously. And a good example of that would be, just a little one, would be the Obama administration statements about the drone wars. And so they were challenged, when they basically did announce a global battlefield, to explain why it wasn't one. And they said, well, we would never bomb a civilized country. Essentially, they said that openly. Well, what does that mean? Were they really referring to a matter of fact, like there are some places that are just bad or badly governed or ungoverned? Or are they really talking about the white peace that America provided in 1945 after two disastrous world wars, and at the price of taking on board global war against non-whites? Well, that continues. America still fights global wars, but it hasn't had a white enemy. with the sole exception of the Southeast Europe wars in which it was engaged, interestingly on behalf of Muslim victims. But with that really interesting counterexample, I think we can still say there's a white peace in the world, and a lot of war, including great power war, outside that area. Catherine, great to be with you. I'll just mention that the Swiss remain deeply convinced that the laws of war had to be humanized as a Christian project long into the era after World War II. And I present some evidence that some of them really did think that this was bound up with the fate of Christianity. Now, of course, they interpret Christianity differently after World War II, and they have a lot of they're destabilized by the fact that there's decolonization and Christianity on the wane in Europe is on the rise in new states around the world. So I didn't do a full story of that, but I do think it's a really important topic to look at the way the humanization agenda from the beginning in the 19th century, even down through the 1960s and 70s, was related to and an outcome of a certain kind of set of Christian developments.
That's fascinating. Thank you, Professor Moyn. And there are lots of excellent questions here. We won't have time for them all, but just to note, thanks to Declan Owens for your question, Lodevijk, David Hershey, and there's a great question there by Teresa about Foucault. But maybe just one brief last question, because it ties in to what you were saying about America would never bomb a civilized country. Sean asks, why does the USA believe that democracy is the only way to govern, and why does it not take account of individual countries' culture and history and then try to layer in some form of democracy? I mean, you may or may not agree with that, but I wonder if you'd have any thoughts on that.
It's a fair question. You know, when Americans fail, they discover cultural diversity and opacity. A good example, just to come back to the earlier question, is Samantha Power's memoir, where she says, well, it's true, we went into Libya to out of the best of intentions, and I believe that, at least in part, and in her case, and then it didn't work out. And she says, well, the reason was that because of cultural difference, plus the Europeans failed to kind of clean up the aftermath. But so that's an example where there can be a sense of cultural difference. So I've experienced American wars. It seems like it's effaced at the beginning of wars, when it's as if, you know, humanity wants the same kind of freedom, no matter its history and trajectory. And at the end, when it seems to have refused that freedom, the reason cited is cultural difference. I don't see democracy promotion of the kind your question references coming back anytime soon. I mean, we talked earlier in the webinar about the likely endurance of American war, but I think Biden did register that those who believe that it's just not possible to engage, certainly through force of arms, in forced democratization of a country, they seem to have the upper hand, and I think their experiences suggest that we need to think long and hard before we try that again, to figure out how it could be done, if it can.
Thank you so much, Sam. We'd love to talk to you all day, but we can't. But we'd just like to thank you immensely for sharing your precious time, and many thanks to everybody for attending and for really great questions. As you know, Sam, you're a very influential thinker and a prolific scholar, and this book touches on Important and fascinating questions relating to international humanitarian law, the use of force, and US foreign policy, amongst other themes. We've been so grateful to have the opportunity to speak to you today about your incredible scholarship. We look forward to following you in the coming years. Is there anything else you'd like to raise or to say before we wrap up, Sam?
No, just that it was my privilege, and I'm very grateful for the engagement.
Thanks again. So thanks to everyone. Thanks to Professor Moyn. And with that, I'll close the session.